This meeting is being recorded.
It always sounds threatening to me.
Be careful what you say.
That's right. One of these days, we will have a smooth opening to this. It will be seamless. On that day, the world will end.
Oh, yeah.
All right, here we are. Before we start this up today, does anyone have any questions, thoughts from previous weeks, or things that have occurred to you? And Bob Dennis is always good for coming up with a question. We're missing him. All right. Well, taking silence as a negative, which is a logical fallacy, the Lord be with you. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. All right, and let me just remind everybody that this prayer we use, which is one of the ones out of the prayer book, that grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, is not just pious language, but it is an outline for a way of praying the scriptures that monks have done since about the 5th or 6th century. The idea being read, you read it meditatively, take a passage, and don't just see how fast you can get through it, but just read what's going on. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, to the end that all that believe in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Mark doesn't mean sit there with your marker in your hand, but note well not only what's going on in the passage, but what's going on in yourself while you're doing it. For God so loved. Oh, what's that so? Is that so that so very much loved us, or that so God loved us in this way? That he gave. Gosh, well, what's the giving? What's going on there? To sort of note what's going on in the passage, to learn, to memorize part of it, to take something that you will take with you through the day and inwardly digest. And here the monks use the example of rumination, like a cow chewing its cud. Grass is hard to digest, so a cow chews and chews and chews and chews, and then swallows it into their first stomach to be worked on, and then brings it back up a little later when it's partly digested and does that. So you could carry through the day, for God so loved. And you bring it up every once in a while in different situations, and you think about it. So that it's really great when you're reading, you got your Bible out and you're by yourself, and that's just a wonderful thing. But then you get a little later in the day and you're driving your car, and you are, of course, thinking your own thoughts, and you don't notice that the light has turned green, and someone helpfully behind you taps their horn 4 or 5 times to remind you that it's time to go. Oh, well, what are you going to think at that moment? Well, that's probably a pretty good time to bring up "For God so loved." Now, don't be like my grandmother. The story that my oldest cousin told was he was riding with her one day, and she pulled out into an intersection to make a left turn. And then the light changed and she just sat there. And she had 4 lanes of traffic honking at her. And he was going, "Grandmother, why don't you go?" And she said, "Well, Rhodes, so I've learned that sometimes it's best to just stop and think for a minute." But this pattern is a way to enter into the scriptures, to pray the scriptures, and to carry them with you through the day. So, all right. I don't know why this slide has survived. This is from the first week, so we skip over that. But last week we had John, feet on the ground, having a vision, a sort of earthly vision, seeing things. But then a door opened into heaven, and up he goes to heaven, and he's in the heavenly court. He sees, well, he doesn't see God on the throne, because you can't look at God, but he sees something amazing, surrounded by the 4 living creatures, the sea and elders and the torches and all of this. And so this week it says, "I saw in the right hand of the one seated on the throne a scroll written on the inside and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, 'Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?' And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. And I began to weep bitterly, because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. Then one of the elders said to me, 'Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals.'" All right. Now, this is not an actual ancient scroll. This is a reproduction of a scroll, but it is a reproduction of one from the time of Jeremiah that was found in Egypt. One of the great things about Egypt, because there are places where it never rains, so if something got buried in the sand, you can find it. And there's a whole library, the Nag Hammadi library, that's just scroll after scroll after scroll that were taken out into the Egyptian desert and buried by some monks in the 4th century, because they were part of a divergent group within Christianity, and they were afraid that their library would be burned if it was found. So we've got all of these wonderful things. But what you've got is, you can see the seals, and there are 3 different seals on here, which in an ancient setting would have indicated that there were 3 witnesses to what was going on in the scroll, a contract, whatever. The seal, it's not like, when we think of sealing a letter, we think of someone taking wax and putting it on the letter and stamping it so it holds the letter closed. In this case, the seal is not stuck to the letter, to the scroll. It guards the knot in the string. And what you can't see is that, aside from having string running around the scroll, there are also strings that are going back in the scroll as it's rolled up. And what this does is it keeps you from being able to sort of sneakily get things off before you open the scroll. So the scroll has been witnessed, but if you're going to open it, you're going to have to break each of those 3 seals. So opening, is kind of a final thing. There's no steaming open the letter with the teapot. It's obvious it's going to be open. This, by the way, is papyrus. And you could have basically three ways of doing a scroll in the ancient world. Papyrus was an early form of paper. The Egyptians would take reeds and weave them together, and then they would pound them until they were sort of mashed into one thing. and then that was allowed to dry, and that gave you a writing surface. You could also use calfskin, from which we get what's called vellum, vellum, or parchment, which is from lambskin, sheepskin. And if you've ever heard of a sheepskin diploma, that's it. The advantage of the vellum or parchment is if you wrote something and you didn't want to have it anymore, you wanted to reuse this expensive paper, you could take a knife and scrape off what was on it. And if you want a really interesting word, Donna, I think you're taking the notes. Palimpsest, PALIMPSEST. And that's a document that's been cleaned. And the thing about it is you can find in a medieval monastery a book that's, say, on parchment. And if you take the pages of that book, and I think they use x-rays to do this, you can actually read what was on it another time, what is behind the writing that's currently on it. So it's a lot of medieval scholarship is done by looking at palimpsest. All right, so here we have the scroll, the seals. This one just happens to be parchment, and this is probably a letter or a contract, because you'll notice it's fairly small. Has anybody here ever been to a synagogue service? Okay, well, if you go to the synagogue, when they pull the Torah scroll out, the Torah scroll is this wide and it's this big around. So as you read it, you open it and you got to turn it like this to read it. When we get to the scroll written on the inside and on the back, this is something that it's probably, I think the thing they're trying to go for is that it's really full of information. You know, that the message you've got is a big message and it's kind of leaking around on all sides. But unless it was a small thing like this, written on the back would be difficult to manage in a traditional scroll. But okay, what you've got, I saw in the right hand of the one seated on the throne. The right hand, remember, is the hand of power. God did this with a mighty arm and an outstretched hand. The right hand of God is the hand of power. But it's also a sign of ownership. And what we've got here is an interesting thing, because when he sees the figure on the throne in the vision, he's not seeing, he's seeing all of these things like the gems and the fire, and so it's a question of whether he sees a fully human being with two hands or whatever. But it is also a sense here that this is a literary vision. It's a vision that's meant to be read aloud and heard by the listener. So if the image shifts a little bit, that's okay, because he's telling a story. God himself is holding this scroll, and it is full of information, and it's sealed with 7 seals, 7 witnesses. And you'll find that some of these witnesses are actions. They are things you are going to see come to pass. And we're getting this idea of the one on the throne holding the seal, and written on the front and the back, comes out of visionary literature. Ezekiel, the beginning of Ezekiel, the first few chapters of Ezekiel are Ezekiel's call. And in the second chapter, he spread it before me, a scroll. He spread a scroll before me, It had writing on the front and on the back, and written on it were words of lamentation and mourning and woe. And then we don't read the books of Enoch, but in First Enoch, which they would have read in first century circles, he said to me, look at the book of the tablets of heaven and what is written upon them, and note every individual fact. And I looked at everything that was written, and I noted everything, and I read the book and everything that was written in it. All the deeds of men and all the children of flesh will be upon the earth for all the generations of eternity. So you got a couple of things going on in this background. One is that a kind of God's judgment is written in one vision on a throne. The other is that sort of like the history of the world is written out. And if you remember, I mean, when we think of apocalyptic literature, we think in terms of trying often, at least as they're popularly done, trying to make things, find a literal interpretation of what's in there to apply to, say, today. Whereas this is heavy symbolism. And throughout the Old Testament, the action of God and the events of history are seen to be one and the same. If you think of an event like the Babylonian exile, the prophets before it happened, and we had a two-stage conquest of Israel. You remember there were two kingdoms, big, powerful Israel in the north, and smaller and not quite so powerful Judah in the south. And the Assyrians conquered Israel and carted the inhabitants off in the century before the downfall of Judah under Babylon. So the prophets were there going, you're being unrighteous, you're getting involved in these very shaky political alliances when you should be trusting in God. Look what happened to them. and so the events of history are often where the actions of God are lived out in the Bible. Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals? So obviously this is a central thing here with the 7 seals, and no one in heaven, the elders, the beasts, the 4 living creatures, no one in heaven can do it. Nobody on earth can do it, and nobody who's dead can do it. I mean, we're looking at a wide range, and no one is worthy. And I began to weep bitterly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. And this weeping bitterly, a lot of times in visionary literature, you get sort of excessive emotion. This is really focused and powerful stuff going on. So then one of the elders, one of the 24, said to me, do not weep, dry your tears, because the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered. He's victorious, so that he can open the scroll in its 7 seals. In Genesis, Judah is the lion's whelp, and we're talking about one of Jacob's sons, Judah, the progenitor of the tribe of Judah, and the kingdom of Judah was ruled by a descendant of Judah, David. The ideal king, the king that everybody looks back to and says, boy, we'd like to have another one. Or that the prophets would say, you're going to have another king like David one of these days. David is the original Messiah. Now, everyone who is a king was anointed. And HaMashiach means the anointed one. But David was God's particular, special, beloved anointed. But back in Genesis, you've got Judah is a lion's whelp. He crouches down, he stretches out like a lion, he dares to rouse him up. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him and the obedience of the peoples is his. And there's a sense, and of course, every time you've got a royal dynasty, they're going to say, God's going to preserve us forever. And we could go through historical examples of that. And so what you have in Judaism in the Old Testament, there was this sense that there would always be a Davidic king, a descendant of David on the throne. And then suddenly there wasn't. The Babylonian captivity, there's this story, it's in Jeremiah, where King Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, tries to escape from Jerusalem. And he's captured by the Babylonians, and his sons are killed in front of him, and then he's blinded. The last thing he sees is the death of his sons. And then he is kept in Babylon, and he eats dinner every night at the king's table. That's the last king of Judah. But so they began to look for God to give another Davidic king. And all of the things about the Messiah and Jesus are born out of that hope. But the other thing, you've got the Lion of the tribe of Judah and the root of David. And in Isaiah, a shoot shall come from the stock of Jesse, David's father, and a branch shall grow out of its root. The tree may be cut down, but have you ever tried to get rid of a tree just by cutting down the trunk? All of this stuff comes up. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him, the spirit of wisdom and understanding. So these two ideas, Lion of the tribe of Judah, root of David, the traditional Messiah is the one who can do this. And when it says he's conquered, that word again is Nike, remember the shoe, and that's victory. The Greek goddess of victory was Nike. So triumphed, it could be a military triumph, it could be a sport triumph. He has triumphed, he's conquered, he has won the right to do this. And victory gets used throughout the Revelation again and again. So then I saw between the throne and the four living creatures. So up there near the throne, and this is going to shift as time goes on, but and among the elders, little lamb, and it doesn't translate that way in any translation, but the word is a diminutive for lamb. Standing, and here again we get into the literary side of this, it is standing as if it had been slaughtered. How do you stand as if you had been slaughtered? It's okay. It is because this is the living lamb who has been slaughtered. And one of the things, let's see, the word that's used for the lamb that was slain is not a reference to sacrifice. A lot of times people want to think of the Passover lamb, the lamb that was sacrificed, but this word is the word for violent death. And it will be used again in the Revelation, but where it's used again, it's like for one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So we're looking sort of beyond the old sacrificial system to something else going on here. Having 7 horns and 7 eyes, and horns are symbols of power. And of course, with the eyes, we've got all of those visions like Ezekiel, where things are covered with eyes. This is a Hindu god. This is Vishnu here. But the reason for showing this picture is you've got all of these faces and all of these hands. And why do the Hindu gods have all of that? It is so because they are so powerful. It's as if they can do all sorts of things because they got all these hands. They can see all sorts of things because they have all these faces. That's also a bunch of different identities as well, but we don't need to get into that here. But the idea of the 7 horns and the 7 eyes, the Lamb is really powerful. And since there are 7 horns, 7 spirits and 7 churches, the Lamb has strength and authority over those 7 churches. And with the 7 eyes, can see everything. So this is a powerful image, but you'll notice that there's a shift here because the angel has said, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of Jesse, and he turns to look for the lion and he sees the lamb, the slaughtered lamb. So this is not the conquering lion. This is not the mighty king who's coming in power. The path to God's victory is through sacrifice. As Jesus in John's resurrection images still bears the wounds of the cross. See my hands, put your hand in my side. So here, the Lamb is always the Lamb who was slain, and the power of God is ultimately the power of sacrifice. And the Lamb went and took the scroll from the right hand of the one who is seated on the throne. So from the right hand, from the hand of ownership and the hand of authority and power, the Lamb takes the scroll. Let's not think of the Lamb going up and taking it in its mouth. Remember, this is Jesus in this vision we're talking about. But I'm sure I haven't skipped anything. Okay. When he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell before the Lamb. Okay. In the earlier vision, which dealt sort of with creation, the whole creation worshiping God, the elders and the creatures fall down before God on the throne. Now they're falling down before the Lamb. So you're seeing that these are parallel liturgies which are going on. In Jewish tradition, in their visions, you would expect to have angels in the slot where we have elders. But here we have the elders because the elders are representing, the powers of the earth. But they fall down and worship before the Lamb, and each is holding a harp and golden bowls of incense, which are for the prayers of the saints. Now, kind of hard to play the harp when you've got a bowl of incense, kind of hard to do this when balancing the harp, and it gets really strange if you think of them falling down. But we're just trying to get this vision filled with as much imagery of praise and worship as we can. And the golden bowls are the prayers of the saints. Our prayers are going up as a fragrant offering to God. And there's this whole thing in the Old Testament, when they're talking about sacrifice, they frequently say that the sacrifice is a pleasing odor to God, the burning of the sacrifice. Well, over time, you're replacing sacrifice with, sacrifice is worship, but the worship itself is taking the place of the sacrifice. And in fact, by the time you get to the Revelation to John, the temple's been gone for 50 years or so. So there is no place to hold sacrifice. And they sing a new song. And the idea of a new song, throughout the Psalms, we have sing to him a new song, play skillfully on the strings with loud shouts. And that singing a new song to the Lord just appears again and again and again. And the new here is not just like you went to the store and bought a new song. This is a fresh song. This is new as a quality rather than new as just a new thing. I don't know if you remember, but in Greek, there are two words for time. Chronos, which is the time you have on your watch, and kairos, which is time loaded with meaning. When Franklin Roosevelt said December the 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, he's talking about kairos. He's not talking chronos. And I didn't note the other word for new in Greek, but there is a word in Greek for I went to the dealer and bought a new car. But kainos is what it feels like to sit in the new car and have the new car smell and all of the things associated with that. They're singing a fresh, brand new song. You are worthy to take the scroll and to open the seals, for you were slaughtered, and by your blood you ransomed for God. And remember that, and the imagery of blood gets used throughout Christian history in all sorts of different ways. But remember, go back to Deuteronomy. Be sure that you do not eat the blood, for the blood is the life. And it is a very simple, very primitive thing. If you've got blood going around in you, you're alive. If it's gone. So you were slaughtered, you gave your life, you ransomed to God. Saints, holy people from every tribe and language and people and nation. It is beyond the people of Israel to people from every nation on the earth. And you have made them to be a kingdom of priests serving our God, and they will reign on earth. Now, you'll notice in this that in the song, you have ransomed. The ransoming has already taken place, and you have made them to be a kingdom of priests to serve our God. The saints, the members of the seven churches, are already priests and kings, are a kingdom of priests. And so, again, the veil is lifted, and you may be sitting in your pew at St. Andrew's on the Sound on a Sunday morning, the 28th Sunday after Pentecost in year C of 2022. And you don't realize it, but you're already a priest in the kingdom. That's the hidden reality that is revealed in this heavenly vision. There's more going on in our lives than meets the eye. Okay. And here, this is a good Reformation era illustration of the Lamb. You see, he's got his 7 horns and his 7 eyes, and everybody's around him with bowls of incense and their harps and just, this is of course a black and white engraving by Albrecht Dürer, but to give you a sense of, if you're trying to put this all together, it can be pretty rich. Then I looked, and I heard the voice of many angels surrounding the throne. Well, we've suddenly got bunches of angels up there, living creatures and the elders. They numbered myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands, singing with a full voice. And the angels sing a similar song. Worthy is the Lamb that was slaughtered to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. Then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea, and all that is in them, singing to the one seated on the throne and to the Lamb, be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. And the 4 living creatures said, Amen. And the elders fell down and worshiped. I say those elders must have been in great shape. Had pads on their knees. this thing about the numbers, Book of Daniel, stream of fire issued and flowed out from his presence. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood attending. And then we're going beyond that in First Enoch. After this, I beheld thousands of thousands and myriads of myriads and an infinite number of people standing before the Lord of spirits. Over time, the images get richer and richer and richer. And so we're really getting this here, but we've got essentially all of creation singing now. Every creature in heaven and on earth. St. Francis would be thrilled doing this. There's also, they are expanding what's been said before, because the Lamb is not just worthy to open the scroll, but worthy to receive power, and wealth, and wisdom, and might, and honor, and glory, and blessing. And then, whereas before, we're looking at everyone in heaven, on earth, and under the earth, we've added the sea. And you've got to remember that the sea is something that in the Hebrew cosmology surrounds the earth. So we're going out and kind of, you remember you got the waters above the firmament and the waters below. This is the entire universe now that's involved here. One of the things we've got going on here is that as we move into the 2nd century, Christology, the sense of who Jesus is developing. And the church in every age has tried to sort of come up with its own story of what is God doing in Jesus. And if you look back and we've come up with ultimately a kind of absolute identification of God in Jesus. But here, as the church is working through it, it is developing. So back in Luke, Jesus could say to somebody who calls him good master, why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. Jesus' primary religious experience, as portrayed in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is hearing the voice, you are my beloved son, in you I'm well pleased. A relationship that's not defined in Mark, it's defined a bit more in Matthew and Luke with the birth stories. But one of my first boss preached a sermon once asking the question, what if that's Jesus, all Jesus had to go on was that experience of sonship from God. But there is not that kind of absolute identification in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. By the time you get to John, the Father and I are one, or I am in the Father and the Father is in me. But that's kind of an identity of will in John. I don't say anything or do anything but what the Father tells me. But up here in the Revelation, we're seeing worship of God on the throne and worship of the Lamb. And as we move through the Revelation, God and the Lamb are going to become one image. And it was really only, when you think of the Nicene Creed, that's a 4th century work. It actually is more properly called the Niceo-Constantinopolitan Creed. You can write that down if you like, just do your own spelling. But that's because the Council of Nicaea was in the 320s, and the Council of Constantinople was much later in the century. And that creed comes out of the work of a series of councils that comes up that by that time, the church has the idea of the absolute identity of Jesus and the Father. Part of this is trying with the idea of the Trinity, which is something that just sort of appears in the New Testament, baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, where they're trying to preserve the idea of the Trinity, but to do that within the unity of God. And I don't know if anyone here was here for my first Pentecost, but I juggled for my first Pentecost, because the idea is the Trinity for me is a concept that only can be understood in motion. That if you put it statically on paper, it just doesn't work. But at any rate, we have here a Christology that is bringing the Lamb closer and closer to identifying the Lamb as God, as well as the one on the throne as God. But I think we're still working on that. So, okay. And now we start getting to the movie stuff. Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Then I saw the Lamb open one of the seven seals. And what's going to happen with each of these seals, as each seal is broken, something happens. And the thing about it is, we haven't even gotten into seeing what's in the scroll yet. Break the first seal and something happens. You know, open the door, the alarm goes off. You're not in the house yet, but you've got something back there going, meep, meep, meep. I saw the Lamb open one of the seven seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures call out as with a voice of thunder. And we've had voices of thunder before, but it's come. It's a commandment. I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and the conqueror. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature call out, "Come!" And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people would slaughter one another. And he was given a great sword. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature call out, "Come." I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider held a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's pay, a denarius literally, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, but do not damage the olive oil in the wine." When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature call out, "Come." I looked, and there was a pale green horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed with him. They would give him authority over the fourth of the earth to kill with sword, famine, pestilence, and by the wild animals of the earth. So here you have, once again, Albrecht Dürer, probably the most famous illustration of the four horsemen. In popular culture, the four horsemen of the apocalypse have kind of assumed this identity separate from the rest of the story. They're in movies, they're in just other things. And you've got to remember that the apocalypse that they are the horsemen of is not the end of the world. It's the apocalypse of John. It's the revelation to John. They are the four horsemen found in John's apocalypse. So let's look a little more closely at it. All right. So the first of the horsemen comes on a white horse. White is a sign of victory, just as the martyrs wear white robes because they are victorious. So he's got a white horse. Its rider had a bow. Well, the proverbial mounted soldiers with bows, the people who fired from the saddle in the ancient world, were the Parthians. You ever heard of a parting shot? A parting shot is actually a Parthian shot. And that means they could ride up, turn around, and as they're riding away, shoot a bunch of arrows. So you've got these people who you can't fight shooting at you, and they come up, shoot as they're riding away. The Parthians were on the eastern border of the empire. And the borderlands of the empire were dangerous places. And one of the instable empires, as they grow, become inherently unstable. because of communication, but also because of threats. We hear a lot about the Mexican border, our southern border, as a porous, threatening thing. It's nothing compared to the border of the Roman Empire, which started on the coast where France and Spain met, went all the way across Europe, around the Middle East, and then across Africa, below Egypt and North Africa. And so if there was going to be a threat, you've heard of barbarian invasions. That usually refers to Germanic tribes coming into Rome from the north, but Rome was constantly threatened along the border. And in fact, if you, for example, read in the New Testament, people who are reading Acts, they speak about cities as Roman colonies. What the Romans would do is they would either take an existing city or found a new one in the borderlands, and they would build a section of it that was laid out like an army camp. Only instead of tents, you had houses, and they would settle veterans there so that if there was an immediate crisis, the veterans could be the ready reserve that would handle things until the real troops could get there. The famous Roman roads were there. I mean, just as the interstate highway system was built to have a diffuse transportation system where armies could move around America in case of invasion or attack, so the Roman roads were built primarily so that the armies could move quickly from place to place. So it could be that what you have here is John, remember that the enemy in the Revelation ultimately is the Roman Empire. And John is perhaps anticipating an invasion from the east. Again, the action of history. And we notice that ultimately the Roman Empire, as it fell apart because it could not handle being stretched out like this. And from different areas, it was conquered. Okay. Second seal, I heard the second living creature call out, "Come," and out came another horse, bright red, red the color of blood, red the color of slaughter. And this one's a bright red horse. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people would slaughter one another. Just as the lamb was slaughtered, violent death, people would slaughter one another. He was given a great sword. So we have invasion, general warfare, and then when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature call out, "Come." And I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider held a pair of scales in his hand, and I heard what seemed to be the voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, a day's pay, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay. But do not damage the oil in the wine." What you've got here is that the basic diet of the common people in the staples in that period were bread, oil, and wine. And here, one of the books said is that they're saying that the cost of wheat and barley is about 8 times what it would normally have been. Yeah, well, wow. Well, but what we have, this is sort of beyond inflation because this is famine. Yeah. Fortunately, we're not at famine yet. But if you think about the effect, just that, the Ukraine is the breadbasket of a large part of the world. And there is now hunger in Africa because of warfare in Ukraine. And so here, what we're seeing progressively is the effects of war. And so, by the way, if you were prosperous, you'd eat wheat. If you were poor, you ate barley, because you need to eat more barley to get the same nutrition. And so the bread is expensive, to not damage the oil and the wine. And one of the commentaries said this might be a reference to an edict from the Emperor Domitian around the year 92, where there was a famine, and he ordered that olive groves and vineyards be cut down so that wheat and barley could be planted. So whether this is just a reference to a headline, we don't know, but it's an interesting thing to say. And finally, he opened the fourth seal, and I heard the voice of the fourth living creature call out, "Come." And I looked, and there was a pale green horse. Now that's a sick horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And then a general statement. These four were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, with famine and pestilence. The first two are killing with the sword, warfare. And then we've got the aftermath of warfare, famine and pestilence. And how you get pestilence in warfare is when people are besieged in cities. Food gets short, water supplies get contaminated, people get sick. And again, back to Ezekiel. He must have had a little pocket copy, a scroll of Ezekiel. For thus says the Lord of God, how much more when I send upon Jerusalem my 4 deadly acts of judgment: sword, famine, wild animals, and pestilence, to cut off humans and animals from it. And you'll notice that in the midst of this, with all the others, even though they weren't, there's not a horseman for them, but the wild animals of the earth are going to be involved here. So we're coming to the end of our time today. Any comments or questions?
Just turn on the television like that.
Well, and it, what, the whole question that comes up is, people said, is COVID a sign of the end? And you remember when Jesus said, there will be wars, and there will be rumors of wars, and there'll be earthquakes, and there'll be all sorts of things. He says, and the time is not yet. He said, well, he's saying this is ordinary stuff, if you think Hurricane Florence is the end of the world, well, wait till the end. It's gonna happen. But what John is saying is that God is at work in all. Now, whether it's the final end is going to happen, in our experience, the final end does not seem to come after these things. I mean, it may well come, but this is a story of living in hope through what's going on here. Has anyone here ever seen the movie Time Bandits? And George Harrison did it. It's a very silly movie, but the idea behind it is that God only had 7 days to make the entire universe, so there's some holes in it. And there are these 7 sort of dwarves who worked with God on creation. They were part of the crew that built creation, and they have a map of the holes, and they can go through the holes, and they pick up this kid and go on adventures. But at the very end, the supreme being shows up, and he's this British character actor, large man in a gray tailored suit, and he's going, terribly sorry to be so late. Must have had too much to do, you know. And so we keep waiting for that kind of show up. And I think one of the things to reflect on more properly is, instead of waiting for God to come in and fix everything, is how are we experiencing God now? How do we find hope now? How do we live in hope now? So there we have it. But thank you very much. And we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, Richard.
Bye-bye.